Thank you for inviting me here. As a retired nuclear physicist who has been studying the evidence about UFOs since 1958, and since 1967 has given well over 700 lectures in all 50 states, 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 other countries, I have reached four major conclusions. One, the evidence is overwhelming that Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underline 10 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. Don't care about them. Two, there is no doubt that a small number of people within governments, both in the United States and overseas, have been actively covering up the truth about these visits. There really is a cosmic Watergate. Three, there are no good arguments against these conclusions, only people who haven't studied the relevant evidence. And four, flying saucer visitations and the cosmic Watergate represent the biggest story of the millennium. And I should say that I prefer the term flying saucer because all flying saucers are UFOs. Very few UFOs are flying saucers. All great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers. I'm interested in the flying saucers, not the UFOs. The basis for these conclusions: A, there are at least 5 large-scale scientific studies which provide substantial evidence. These include Project Blue Book Special Report number 14, the largest study ever done for the United States Air Force, covering more than 3,200 cases with more than 200 charts, tables, graphs, and maps. It is quality evaluation, cross-comparison between unknowns and knowns. The official press release lied about the data. I'll document that in a minute. It is almost never referenced by UFO debunkers. Dr. Carl Sagan, we were classmates at the University of Chicago, claimed there are interesting UFO sightings that are not reliable, and reliable UFO sightings that are not interesting. But there are no cases that are both reliable and interesting. This statement was not backed up by reference to data, but is directly contradicted by the Blue Book Special Report 14 data. It was found that the more reliable the case, the more likely to be unexplainable. United States Air Force Secretary Donald Quarles, in the very widely distributed press release when the 1955 study was completed, flat out lied. It's a strong statement, and I'm sorry to make it, but it's true. He stated, quote, "We believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available." The fact of the matter in the report that he was talking about is that the unknowns comprise 21.5% of the cases, completely separate from the 9.3% listed as insufficient information. The 3% number was a lie. Furthermore, a statistical comparison of the unknowns and knowns showed that the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. It must further be noted that the press release did not give the title of the report or the company that did the work, Battelle Memorial Institute. If they'd given the title, surely some newsman would have said, "Hey, what happened to reports 1 through 13? Had never heard about them." The correct answer, had it been given, would have been that they were all classified. It's a very valuable source of information, this report. It's funny how the debunkers never talk about it. Another primary source of valuable data, which should be of interest to you all, are the congressional hearings of July 29th, 1968, which included testimony from 12 scientists. The most important paper was by Dr. James E. McDonald, professor of physics at the University of Arizona. He had talked to 500 witnesses, but he presented 41 outstanding cases, including multiple witness radar visual sightings, sightings by pilots, by astronomers, by meteorologists. He noted physical trace cases, of which by now more than 5,000 have been collected by Ted Phillips from 95 countries. They get dull. Same thing was happening all over the world. Saucers seen on the ground, It leaves, they find physical changes. Happens here, it happens there, it happens everywhere. 1/6 of those cases involved reports of small beings associated with the craft while it was on the ground. I was the youngest contributor to those, and I think the only survivor since then, to those hearings in 1968. And I was the only one without a PhD. That might tell you something. I'm not sure what. The proceedings, incidentally, are still available online. One of the contributors was Dr. J. Allen Hynek, chairman of the astronomy department at Northwestern University, and for 20 years, United States Air Force scientific consultant to Project Blue Book. His book, The UFO Experience, A Scientific Inquiry, should be required reading by anybody who's going to talk about flying saucers, especially negatively. According to another source here, according to a special UFO subcommittee of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, world's largest group of space scientists, 30% of the 117 cases studied by the University of Colorado, government-sponsored study in the late 60s, and discussed in the Condon report, Edward U. Condon, could not be identified. And yet the headline said scientific study shows no UFOs. Totally untrue. There's a 2-volume report called The UFO Evidence, which has loads of data, hundreds of cases that couldn't be identified. There's also the Cometa report from France, which goes into numerous excellent officially involved cases in France. There are a dozen PhD theses about UFOs. One of them demonstrating how poor the press coverage has been. I haven't seen one about coverage by the scientific community or coverage by the political committee. That's another story. Anybody need a PhD thesis topic? There's 2 good ones. Also, a third one, the will not to believe on the part of scientists. It's a sickness, a disease, if you will, infecting people who think they know all there is to know and don't. A really bad example of bias and ignorance appeared in Astronomy Magazine this month, May 2013, by Dr. Phil Plait. He does a blog, The Bad Astronomy. The title of the article, believe it or not, is The Science Behind UFOs. It's a cover story. He somehow manages to mention none of the 5 large-scale scientific studies that I've just talked about, or any of the 5,000 physical trace cases, or any multiple witness radar visual cases, or abductions, nor advanced technology studies at national labs and in industry showing trips to nearby stars in reasonable round-trip times using fusion propulsion are feasible. I worked on fusion back in the early 60s. And to give you a form of reference, every star in the universe or multiverse produces its energy by nuclear fusion. That's what H-bombs are all about. And a good demonstration of the atom and the UFO together, if you will, is that in a very short period, we managed to go from a 10-ton blockbuster, World War II, 1945, took a big B-29 to carry it. That was in 1944. In 1945, the first A-bomb, 15,000 tons of TNT, not 10. 7 years later, which is nothing, cost a lot of money, we set off the first fusion device, an H-bomb, called Mike, incidentally. It released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. So you go from 10 to 15,000 to 10 million tons. And the Russians sent off one that was 50 million tons of TNT. The point is, we know how to get to the stars if we want to spend the money. I'm not saying it's the ultimate technology. I'm saying scientific progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. You have to change how you do things. And, you know, what gets to me, having worked on fusion propulsion, fission propulsion, nuclear reactors for space applications and all the rest of this, is that we tend to forget that if you make enough stupid assumptions, you can prove almost anything is impossible. One quick example, one astronomer in 1941, he was fed up with all the science fiction stuff about going to the moon. That was nonsense, he said. So he published a scientific, in quotes, paper calculating the required initial launch weight of a rocket able to get a man to the moon and back. Legitimate question, how big is it got to be? Pages of equations, he concluded it have to weigh 1,000,000 tons. He was off by a factor of 300 million. Proving if you make enough stupid assumptions, you can prove anything is impossible. So we have reason to be very careful when somebody says something is impossible. I have a whole book of It's Impossible, Isn't It? Was going to be the title, but Science Was Wrong is what the publisher decided on. I like the first one better, but anyway. Let's look at another progression, not only in bombs. Ferdinand Magellan's ship, he didn't make it, but his ship did, went around the planet in 3 years, in 1523. 3 years. 3 years before the mast, you might say. Science fiction writers had going around the world in 80 days in the 19th century. The space station goes around the world in 90 minutes. Progress comes from doing things differently. A second problem I found, I worked under security for 14 years for major companies like GE, GM, Westinghouse, McDonnell Douglas, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics. I set a record for working on canceled government-sponsored research and development program. Not intentionally, you understand. Another one of the false myths is that governments can't keep secrets. 2 astronomers have demonstrated this. Dr. Seth Shostak of the SETI Institute, you know, S-E-T-I, that stands for Silly Effort to Investigate, incidentally. That's another story, which I've written about in the book. Said you can prove that the government can't keep secrets by how badly FEMA fouled up with Katrina and how poorly the post office is operated. Now, if you can see a connection between either of those things and governments keeping secrets, I sure can't. He didn't mention the CIA, the DIA, the NRO, the NSA, and all those other alphabet soup agencies. Another great astronomer, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, head of Hayden Planetarium, he said the proof that governments can't keep secrets is shown by how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. Now, if you can figure that one out, you're better than I am. Now, the proof, and I'll show some of this in my lecture Tuesday night, about government cover-up. It's not just an idle concept. If you wish, you can get a hold of 156 top secret Umbra NSA UFO documents. They're not very interesting because all you can read is one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out, not blacked out. They said that was too impressive on television when I used that. They told me this. And the reason is everything else is sources and methods. 98% sources and methods and 2% UFOs, but it's filed under UFOs. Come on, that makes no sense. You can get a bunch of CIA, and I'll show some of these too, blacked out UFO documents. So highly redacted that you can read about 6 words per page. And my favorite thing, and it took me 3 years to get this, was one of the CIA UFO documents that says on the top, deny in toto. They couldn't find 6 lousy words to declassify. Something's wrong here. And I have to tell you, 1 minute? Okay, I won't tell you. Maybe I'll tell you that Tuesday night. One more thing. Air Force General Carol Bolender stated that UFO reports which could affect national security, he was asked to look about what we should do about Project Blue Book, are not part of the Blue Book system. UFO reports which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. Incredible statement. I located him, I talked to him on the phone, he verified there are 2 separate reporting channels. He never heard that from the Air Force. His job was to decide what to do about Project Blue Book, and it was canceled because of this memo. But the public never heard that he said, reports which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system. People are surprised. Just one more sentence here, 2 sentences. I've won several debates on UFOs. I've only had 11 hecklers and over 700 lectures. It's past time for the press, scientific, and political communities to do their homework. And I should add, at least 3 UFO crashes have occurred. You'll hear more about those later in these hearings. Thank you very much.
A few things. Thank you very much for your testimony. Very, very good, very good. Mr. Freeman, you were going to answer or add something to what Congressman Woolsey said. I'll give you that opportunity for a minute of my time if you'd like.
Okay. I was going to recite 6 reasons for...
Probably can't do 6 in a minute. Give me a minute.
Oh, sure you can. You want to figure out how the saucers work. You worry about the other guy figuring out how the saucers work. You worry about it if an announcement would be made that the younger generation would push for an earthling orientation if we're told the planet's being visited. No government, including ours, wants that. We have the problem of Pat Robertson saying all the UFO stuff is the work of the devil, and all the intelligent life in the universe is here on planet Earth. I take issue with that. Finally, we have 2 special things. If they're coming here, some people say it's going to upset our whole technology. They've got things that will get rid of the oil industry, car industry, plane industry, economic chaos.
Reclaiming my time. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
I want to associate my thoughts with Chairman Bartlett when he made the statement that it's the height of human arrogance to think that we are the only sentient human beings in the galaxies of the world that can think. That's human arrogance at its worst. What I'm struck with the testimony of all 4 of you, and of course the readings that we had in preparing for this hearing, is the fact of secrecy itself. You know, why do we need this secrecy? And I'm asking this question to all 4 of you. What threats do you think exist to the national security that warrants this kind of security, this kind of an approach? Please.
I started to say before, I can see 6 reasons for our government and other governments to keep things classified. First, you want to figure out how they work. They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. And with the Cold War going on, if you do have wreckage and you want to figure out something, you're not going to want to tell your enemies. The second problem is, what if they figure out how they work before you do? You don't want them to know, you know, they know. Weapon, counter-weapon, counter-counter-weapon. We've been playing this game a long time. The third problem is, if there were an announcement, I say by highly trusted individuals, it's a little hard to find them around the planet, but my favorite odd couple is the Pope and the Queen. They're about the same age, or they were until recently anyway. If they were to make an announcement that indeed UFOs are visiting, the planet's being visited, what would happen? Church attendance would go up, mental hospital admissions would go up, the stock market would go down. But I think based on 600 college lectures that the younger generation, which unlike me and probably you wasn't alive when there wasn't a space program, there was strong sentiment against space travel back not too many years ago. The younger generation would push for an earthling orientation. Let's face it, from an alien viewpoint, we are all earthlings, Terrans, as the science fiction writers would say. I know of no government on this planet that wants its people to owe their allegiance to the planet instead of that individual government. As far as I can tell, nationalism is the only game in town. There are some religious problems, extremists who say we're the only intelligent life in the universe, and their followers don't want any part of visitors from outer space. It can't be. Planet was created in 4004 BC instead of 4 billion in 4 BC. A final thing, I have 7 times heard of cases in which pilots were scrambled to chase UFOs. There was a regulation issued, shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so, when 7 pilots didn't come back. These were quiet discussions. These were not big public things. And if I've heard 7, there are a lot more cases like that. There were 200 fatal military plane crashes between 1951 and 56, including 5 where the pilots had over 100 missions in Korea, where there were MiGs trying to shoot them down. That's a pretty good pilot to survive that. Comes back to the United States, no MiGs, and his plane, as the New York Times said, disintegrated or disappeared. 2 strange terms to use in this context. So no families were told anything about that. And it may come as, well, it won't come as a shock to you, but there were 166, Air Force guys on board reconnaissance planes that were tickling North Korea, Russia, and China right after the war. See how quickly the radar came on, what frequency used, and all that sort of stuff. 166 wind up in planes that were shot down. Not one word in public about that. Families were not told until 2001, where a meeting was called and the medals were given out and an explanation was given. I say that only because a lot of people think, well, certainly they would have told the families, those 7 planes. So that's an area of concern, I think, to admit that we can't do anything about these guys. Powerlessness is not something that attracts people to government.
May I add
Please.
a very quick follow-up, and not taking a lot of time? I talked earlier about why I think that the possession of certain radical technology would have initiated some of this secrecy. Also, I think the need to maintain some level of social control, not knowing what these other beings were, at least in the early years. But I think what happens is once a secret goes on for long enough, it becomes a real nightmare to kind of contain. I can only imagine the difficulty that President Obama would face if he were somehow to make this announcement. I mean, really, if he were if something were to force him to make an admission that yes, these UFOs apparently, at least some of them, are real. What does he then say at this press conference? I know what he'd like to say, which is, well, thanks everyone, I'm going on a vacation for about 6 months. Because there are a lot of follow-up questions that would be, frankly, very uncomfortable for him to deal with. I think one of the questions that most responsible journalists would want to ask is, how on earth were you guys able to keep this secret for over 60 years? How did you do it? And the implications for getting into that whole issue are a nightmare, because you're starting to deal with, has there been some level of control or over the mainstream major media, academic community? In fact, there are many off-the-shelf academic studies that show intelligence community influence over our major journalism and over our major academic communities. It's not a big secret. There's a long-standing relationship. But there would be some very deep questions to ask about that, about the nature of special access programs and unacknowledged special access programs, the primordial black budget. All of these would now become the target of citizen inquiry. And I believe firmly that an admission on this topic, in addition to all of the scientific and existential issues that it raises, also gets into just some nasty, concrete political issues that I don't think any presidential administration would want to have to deal with.
I think you're the one that talked about 5 years of hearings for President Truman. And
Briefings, yes.
yeah, and many, well, I know that Mr. Dolan also mentioned this. I guess 16 different, did you say 16 different?
We figure between 16 and 20 briefings.
Okay. Is it possible that the Truman administration was concerned at the time more about either the Soviet Union, which you did mention, I think, Mr. Dolan,
Yeah.
or Nazi Germany? as a source of some of the unidentified flying maneuvers they were watching and reporting on and being very concerned about.
I think it's basically the minute they looked at the Roswell crash, if that was the first crash, they saw technology. It's classified. End of game. This is, you're not giving this to the Soviets, you're not giving it to the Chinese. This is our type of technology. On Thursday, I'll refer to a Canadian government document, 1950, where the Canadians went to the United States, talked to American officials, and one of the things that they were told is that mental phenomena was involved with the saucers. So there's a lot of technology here. To me, it was simple that Truman and the people around Truman saw technology. We need this. This is unbelievable technology, and whoever gets this technology rules the world. We're not giving it away. It's classified. End of the story, and that's how it has started, and that's how it's been maintained.
Stand, please, and repeat after me. I do hereby affirm that I will tell the truth and nothing but the truth to this committee today. Thank you so much.
First of all, I want to say to all of the people that have testified, you have done an incredible job. When I was asked to do this, I debated for a while, and it's a subject literally I know very little about, except what I read in the newspaper, most of it years ago. I was a skeptic when I came, and what I have found, and this has to do with the credibility of the people that have testified. I want you to know that.
Thank you, Representative Hooley. We'll now start with our witnesses, and I think we're allowing 10 minutes each. That's great. If I could ask, okay. Dr. Wood, would you begin?
Thank you. It's an honor to be included as a witness. In 1966, I had been working about 13 years for one company and was doing well as a young engineering executive at Douglas Aircraft. That was the year the Air Force decided to have a symposium dedicated to important developments in space 10 years hence. And my boss, Ray Hallett, had been selected to speak for our missiles and space part of the company on how to better to get things to orbit and back. He asked, what do you think we should talk about? And I said, partly as a jest, why don't we just tell them how the alleged UFOs do it? He actually liked the idea and asked me to work on it. That was when I read my first UFO book, actually one by Don Menzel, the science arch skeptic, and I saw clearly that he was ignoring the reported data. I immediately read a dozen books on the subjects. A year later, Douglas had been bought by McDonnell, and we were now McDonnell Douglas, and had just won the Air Force satellite program called Manned Orbiting Laboratory. My regular job was to manage our company research and development projects funds so that we would win small technology contracts. One day, after I reported to a couple of VPs on how we were doing, one of them asked me personally if I was doing anything interesting outside my job. And I said, well, you're not going to believe this, but I've read about 50 books on UFOs. And the amazing conclusion I've come to is that they are very real extraterrestrial craft, and the only thing that's uncertain is to whether we find out how they work before or after our competitor Lockheed. After a moment of silence, one of them said, how much would it cost to take a look at that question? Therefore, we started a little project, kept quite low-key, to study the question of how they work. Everyone who worked on this project knew that when the project was over, each would go back to his other job or be laid off. This was when we needed to find someone to study the sightings and reports in detail to see if we could get clues as to how they worked, and we hired Stan Friedman. We should have a picture of Stan Friedman up there right now as he looked in 1968. We did a lot of interesting projects, such as measure the effects of a huge magnetic field on the speed of light. There was none. Interview an abductee, tried to invent a physics that would permit travel faster than the speed of light, developed an instrumented van to observe craft sightings anywhere, anytime, and spun magnets in space to try to change their weight. It didn't change. I also became friends with James E. McDonald, a physicist who was making a lot of noise and giving lectures about the details of highly credible sightings. Jim McDonald was very pushy to have my group get more exposure. He urged me to visit the Air Force UFO Condon Committee in 1967 before their report was complete, and talked someone into inviting me to testify at a House Science and Astronautics Committee symposium on unidentified flying objects. I asked my management about this, and they said, "Do what you want, but good things rarely happen to people who testify to Congress." I decided not to testify, largely since I did not have any breakthroughs to even hint at, and if I did, they would have been the property of McDonnell Douglas. Then the military orbiting program was canceled in 1969. Dozens of people were being laid off. We were not making fantastic progress in our project, and I was assigned in 1970 to learn everything I could about radar and ballistic missile defense. We canceled the UFO project and moved on. This project's history was written up in both the International UFO Reporter in 1993, detailing the results of my visit to the Condon Committee, and the MUFON Journal in 2008, elaborating on the details of who did what on this project and what we concluded. I followed the topic of ufology from 1970 to my retirement in 1993 as an avocation, but remained actively absorbing results and reports from MUFON, the Center for UFO Studies, and subscribed to the Flying Saucer Review, which came in a brown paper envelope, so you wouldn't know the subject, published in Britain. The consistency of alien reports occurring psychically caused me to be aware of other anomalous literature, and I had the pleasure of meeting Dean Bob John of Princeton University, who was initiating a consciousness research project. At the same time, my knowledge of radar put me in a position to manage a classified program with top secret access to various subjects. I had read an article by Dr. Hal Puthoff, currently then at Stanford Research Institute, reporting on some amazing results in remote viewing. We used our CIA contacts to work out a test project on coordinate remote viewing, where the subject is allegedly able to observe and describe what is at a specific Earth coordinate. This sensitive remote viewing project wound up being funded by James S. McDonnell, CEO of McDonnell Douglas, who was subsequently told by his lawyers that he should not have used foundation money to accomplish work in his profit-making firm. The results of one test of 6 targets were interesting but not spectacular. We speculated that the viewer might have gone to a coordinate in time when the most emotional events were happening at that location. This project also provided access to anything to do with ballistic missile defense. And I used a nice classified library at another facility to see what there was on the defense against UFOs. There were quite a few intriguing reports available, such as a classified version of the Iranian Air Force F-4 Phantom jet pilot attempting to fire a missile at a UFO only to have his controls shut down as soon as he thought about doing it. Then, after I had borrowed and read quite a few of these anomalous reports, the whole library system was changed so that it was no longer clear where to look for reports. I also stayed aware of anomalies in science in general. And when the so-called cold fusion results of Pons-Fleischmann were announced in 1989, I was aware that our company attempted a quick covert test to try to replicate the results. I was told we were not successful, but by then I was working on advanced technology for NASA International Space Station and not involved in any proprietary activity. After retirement in 1993, my focus on UFOs became the authentication of leaked documents as described on Wednesday. If these documents are valid, they are consistent in telling the story of exposure to the alien technology, attempts to understand it, and many specific tales of successfully understanding the principles and building devices that have become the technology breakthroughs we all enjoy today. There is a case to be made that the 3 crash recoveries of Missouri in April 1941 and LA in February 1942, 1,430 rounds of ammunition during the famous LA air raid, resulted in a specific contract to study how germanium and silicon might be used in the preparation of semiconductors. Those individuals receiving reports and samples included Edward Condon at Westinghouse, Bell Laboratories, Hans Bethe of MIT Radiation Laboratory, and Shockley of Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1945, who is given credit for inventing the transistor in 1947. These leaked documents, taken as a whole, visualize and speculate on the impact of alien technology on our society in a diverse array of fields of science and technology.
And Doctor, you've got about 1 minute left on your time.
Thank you. All right, then I'll ignore mentioning Philip Corso's comments. So, what of my opinion of what's required to understand how they work and to build one? The simple answer is I don't know. But beyond that, I could say I would look for the following 4 things. First, a way to cross the light years to stars without actually physically speeding past and through the space and space debris that separates us. Second, a way to interact with time in a reliable fashion through the equivalent of the so-called wormhole, so that journeys would take years, wind up taking minutes. Third, a way to permit a person's mind to interact with matter so reliably that all you have to do is think clearly, and equipment does what you want it to if it's designed right. Finally, to expect that the breakthroughs will come from unknown scientists, probably pretty young, who are looking outside the establishment's perspective of the solution. I leave you with this thought, that Arthur Clarke's famous quote is highly applicable. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I think that the millions of years that may separate us from the alien civilizations are not significant because logic does not change with time. I expect that the laws of physics, which we have yet to understand, will be the same, and so will the equations. We just have to find them. Does some black program already have this knowledge?
Thank you, Dr. Wood. Let's see, could we now have Dr. Greer take 10 minutes?
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here again. I would like to open with sort of a historical overview of advanced technologies that began in the late 1800s with the breakthroughs with Maxwell and also Faraday. It turns out that the Maxwell equations that were developed had a number of changes that resulted in what is now classic electromagnetic theory. This has resulted in a number of errors in the equations, which have been corrected by people who have looked at them very carefully. Between the late 1800s and 1929, there were a number of breakthroughs that ended up being suppressed that had to do with creating very high voltage VHV systems so that you could create a vector into what's now been called the zero-point energy field. And I refer the panel to the Jane's Defense Weekly writer Nick Cook and his book, The Hunt for Zero Point. This began to be explored by people like Nikola Tesla and others. I have a Department of Defense document that is on a flash drive for each member of Congress that the conference has been given, the citizens' hearings has been given, that shows that when Nikola Tesla died, that this information that he had, which allowed for a car to run out of the ambient energy, was in documents confiscated by the FBI. And I have a Department of Defense document demanding that the FBI turn these over to the DoD. The FBI refused. At any rate, science continues because the laws of the universe are in fact universal, and they can be discovered here or around Alpha Centauri or any place else in the cosmos. By 1928 and 29, T. Townsend Brown, as well as the Koloski-Frost experiment in physics in Germany, had determined that VHV, very high voltage systems, done in a certain resonant field, could result in so-called electromagnetogravitic effect, the lifter effect that has been described, which you see in UFOs. They also can create what's called a space-time bubble around an object so that you can correct for 1G. This is how these objects are traveling at multiples of what any aerodynamic physics would describe, and can make right-hand turns without killing the occupants. Around this same time, there was, in the 1940s and the late 1930s, a number of UFO sightings. This included the so-called Foo Fighters. Yes, it's a famous rock group. However, the Foo Fighters took their name from the reports of these objects seen in the theater of World War II that were flying around our aircraft. We thought it was a secret weapon of the Nazis. The Nazis thought it was a secret weapon of ours. There was Jimmy Doolittle, the famous general. His nephew is a dear friend of mine, and he has testified that General Doolittle was sent by FDR over to the European theater in World War II, investigated the Foo Fighters, and came back and told Roosevelt, and I quote, "They are interplanetary vehicles." So by then, there began a classified program, and which was augmented further by events, as mentioned, in 1941, and then, of course, the famous Roswell event. Those events led to, as Philip Corso describes, a reverse engineering program. As you all know from the famous Wilbur Smith document of 1951 from Canada, it talks about that flying saucers exist, but there's a high-level team headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush that is studying the, quote, modus operandi of these vehicles. These were the most brilliant scientists, Edward Teller, Oppenheimer, and others, Hermann Oberth, amongst others, who were in this team studying how extraterrestrial vehicles move. In October of 1954, a key date I want the committee to remember, we have actionable intelligence from someone who has worked in the National Security Agency and has been in the vault. All of this went deep black because they figured out, at that point, gravity control. So since 1954, October of that year, we have not needed rockets, jets, internal combustion engines, and surface roadways between cities. I say this with authority that this is the case. Eventually, these breakthroughs in human discovery were complemented by the study of the extraterrestrial material that were retrieved from these events. And contrary to most people's thoughts, the Roswell event was actually a downing of an extraterrestrial vehicle by an electromagnetic system that was hidden in a radar dome that was switched on, and this is in an FBI document that I can provide for the committee and is on the flash drive given to the Congress. The result ultimately was that there were trans-dimensional physics that began to be studied that deal with the nexus between electromagnetism, energy generation, anti-gravity, and consciousness. And we have discovered that there is a nexus and that, in fact, there are electromagnetic systems that have been developed that can interface directly with what we call coherent thought, the same way that you can interface with a system with lasers, which is coherent light, where you sync up all the wavelengths. Ultimately, these breakthroughs were paralleled with amazing developments in the biological sciences and the experimentation with cloning. And this began many years earlier than was reported from Dolly the sheep in Scotland. This goes a little beyond, I think, what this committee wants to look into. However, you need to understand that the technologies that we have, and we were discussing, are not theoretical. We have actionable intelligence that any committee in Congress or executive action can find regarding current operations. And I just want to go through a list of them very quickly of these facilities and corporations for which we have witnesses who can be subpoenaed by the committees of the Congress. This was developed at the request of Congressman Christopher Cox of Orange County, with whom I met, and was later further developed for the briefing that we put together for President Obama. These facilities are the Edwards Air Force Base and subsections where, at the dry lake bed where the Lockheed Skunk Works operations, Haystack Butte, China Lakes, George Air Force Base, and the closed Norton Air Force Base, where an anti-gravity device, so-called alien reproduction vehicle, for which we have the schematics, was seen by Frank Carlucci and others on our witness team. Tabletop Mountain and Blackjack Control. The aerospace facilities there are the Northrop Anthill Facility, Tejon Ranch, the McDonnell Douglas Llano Plant, Lockheed Martin Hellendale Plant, and the Phillips Lab. At the Nellis Air Force Facility, so-called Area 51, no one calls it that. There's S4 and S12, Pahut Mesa, Groom Lake, and a number of sub-facilities. The most important facility is in Utah, near Provo, the Dugway Proving Grounds, all of which is underground, and the airspace above it is classified. There are no roads into this facility. The New Mexico facilities include Los Alamos National Labs with underground connectors to the so-called Dulce area where the biological work is being done, and Kirtland Air Force Base. And the complex there includes Sandia National Laboratories, Phillips Labs, Manzano Mountain Weapons Storage Facility, Coyote Canyon, and the White Sands Complex. In Arizona, near Fort Huachuca, which is Army Intelligence Headquarters, there is a UGB underground base where one of our witnesses, who will testify, worked on 9 separate extraterrestrial vehicles that had been down through advanced electromagnetic pulse weapons, and there are several different species of extraterrestrial biologicals stored at that facility. The other facilities, and this goes on, include a special compartmented area of Cheyenne Mountain, where we have witnesses in our team who can be subpoenaed, where we have tracked extraterrestrial vehicles in our solar system that were measuring 26 miles in diameter. There are also facilities in Australia, a key one being Pine Gap, the so-called Alice Springs facility, which is mostly a U.S. Air Force facility, even though it is in Australia. I recently talked to the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia about this. Also, the Redstone Arsenal and the Marshall Space Flight Center. We have a scientist at the Redstone Arsenal who works under contract for IT&T, who have developed these transdimensional systems. He was under contract with my project to bring these energy devices out, and he was then threatened by a former CIA director and what I call the goon squad that went down there 3 years ago in March. This is just part of the information we have, and this information is on the flash drive given to Stephen Bassett's staff, then that you're all welcome to review. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, well done and well timed, because that sign came up just about 3 seconds after you ended. Dr. Vallone, 10 minutes.
I'd like to start with my slides and show them exclusively as I go through them. What I'm about to say is my own personal viewpoint, does not relate in any way to the federal government. Nothing I'm stating is reflecting government policy, and they're my original thoughts as a private citizen. Next slide. This is a presentation of what I'm familiar with, and the beginning of my journey was back in...
Closer if you could,
Sure.
so we could hear you better. Thank you.
My journey began in 1980 with the book called Sunburst: Return of the Ancients by Norman Paulson. And the book was fascinating in the fact that there were a lot of very anomalous UFO details shown. This particular side-by-side photo, and the person who took the photo was a deputy sheriff holding the Instamatic photo taken in broad daylight over Giant Rock. This is fascinating because none of this has happened since then, and Van Tassel, George Van Tassel, was responsible for holding UFO conferences through the 50s and through the 60s. I even talked to Dr. Bob Beck, who witnessed one of these craft, and as you can see, there's some type of force illumination below the craft as well. So I went out to the community and found what they were working on was a homopolar generator. Next slide. The interesting part of the book described the propulsion system as being 12 magnets around the outer edge of a very large disk, size of the ship, carrying off electrical current. 2 disks in opposite direction provided the gravity force, whatever propulsion system they had. So this particular passage I reprinted in my homopolar handbook. Next slide. and also convinced my professor at the State University of New York at Buffalo to let me work on it as a physics project for my master's degree in physics. And I was very pleased to actually build a homopolar generator, test it for back torque, and unfortunately I measured back torque, which means it slows down as you draw current from it. So the mystery continued. Next slide. I basically found that Dr. Ed Mitchell, as you see here on the cover of Extraordinary Science magazine, was also interested in the same topic. Bruce De Palma was the source of the interest, and he was building homopolar generators like crazy, looking for investors one after another, which he succeeded in doing. However, Ed held on to his money, which is in his breast pocket there. And what was interesting about this particular cover that came out years later was that the Searle disk is also shown on the same magazine cover next to the homopolar. So I thought this was sort of a coincidence or synchronicity, and I ended up investigating the Searle disk. Next slide. And I met John Searle in 1980 in Germany, and he actually became kind of a curiosity to me. Even today, he still is. He's still a living legend. He claimed to have these disks, as you can see here, hovering, and he had a UFO experience when he was young, and then he started building these things. So next slide. Basically tried to help him, connected with different people. He essentially became a little more well-known when he gave a talk in Berlin in 1990, and then some Russians discovered him because of that lecture and the video and decided to build what they described as a single roller magnet assembly with 12 roller magnets around the outer edge of a ring. And so I started to think twice, that, hey, this may be something related to what was called the Mu disk back in the Paulson book. And that's one of the biographies you can get off the shelf, Anti-Gravity, The Dream Made Reality by John Thomas. Next slide. So the long story short is that these roller magnets are individual homopolar generators, and they definitely seem to lend itself to voltage generation if the whole ring could somehow be propelled. And that's the magic and the mystery behind the whole thing. Well, the Russians had a whole grocery list, as you can see on the right, of all these anomalies that they supposedly measured. And so what I ended up doing, next slide, was to connect them to an investor, which I constantly do throughout these years, find an investor for the strange inventors, put them together. In this case, we went to the Department of Energy. The contact was very friendly to us, offered a Russian translator for us. We did due diligence for the whole day, and the investor was comfortable to throw his money at the Russian Godin Rosten inventions. And the outcome was, next slide, the big prototype at cost of a lot of money, which was built and completed in Moscow. And then it was retrofitted and completed again and again, and even to this day, it doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do, but it certainly looks interesting. Next slide. So back to the George Van Tassel story, since this is dealing with implications of extraterrestrial technology, George's story is that he had lots of UFO experiences, even rides on craft and so forth. And his, would you say his download or his conclusion from all of these experiences was, hey, I'm going to build a healing chamber, a rejuvenation chamber, called the Integratron. And it's right near Giant Rock. I've actually gone out there. Next slide. And it still is in existence today, Integratron.com. And it's all wood construction with no nails. Next slide. And it's very fascinating because it has these unusual die rods. The whole assembly of die rods was supposed to rotate. And it also has a primary and secondary coil inside that looks like an inverted Tesla coil. So you get the impression that it would draw atmospheric electricity. Since it's very dry there, it's feasible this would work, and then charge up the inside with some of this energy. Next slide. So that concludes the possible rejuvenation implications of ET contact. And what I'd like to conclude with is the zero-point energy, inertial shielding, and electrogravitics. Next slide. First of all, zero-point energy is very famous. I wrote a book on it. I wrote 2 books, actually. And it's been confirmed consistently, even up to last week, where our Future Energy News announced some new polymer pyrrole that actually can't be explained unless 2/3 of it is due to zero-point energy. Next slide. And here we have the reason why zero-point energy may be important, and we'll see if she can insert the 30-second video that's supposed to actually start. I'm not sure if we're going to get a video or not, but, oh, maybe. Okay. Yes. Okay, this is an example of many. You've probably seen some of these already. The craft is spinning. It's up close. It looks like a legitimate, authentic video, amateur video. And right about now, you're going to see a very fast acceleration. And that's what we've been talking about, folks. Let's go back to the slides. The G-forces on that would be incredible. Let's go back to our slideshow if we can. And the important part is that this introduces a concept which I'd like to share with the panel, and that is inertia is involved. And as we get to the next slide, hopefully we can see that. The inertial mass and gravitational mass are totally different. I repeat myself. Inertial mass and gravitational mass have nothing to do with each other. Einstein made a mistake years ago and called it the equivalence principle. I studied it even in grad school. I took relativity and I took general relativity. And so it's fascinating to me that it's sort of overlooked. Slide right after this. And the important part is that nowadays, inertia has been discovered to be a zero-point field Lorentz force by Hayes, Schroeder, and Puthoff. This is a seminal paper that's so important that it opens the door to actually controlling inertia and understanding how any ET craft or UFOs could possibly have fast acceleration, right-angle turns, and maybe even travel through the universe. It turns out F equals V cross B, a simple Lorentz force at the bottom of the slide there showing how it works. So when we go around a curve and you feel that force moving you in the opposite direction, it's an electromagnetic interaction. Next slide. And this applies to relativity. I heard one of the gentlemen on the panels questioning special relativity. Well, that's inertial mass. That is the m in relativistic increase in mass as you go toward the speed of light. If you can shield inertial mass, miracles happen. And this is another demonstration. I showed this slide to the deputy director of the NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, in case you don't know what NRO stands for. And this was very important because, as you see, F equals ma, Newton's law, can be modified. If m can be shielded and it lowers, then a could increase for the same amount of force. Next slide. Oh, and by the way, the NRO deputy director said, well, things like this tend to become more and more classified until they're out of sight. He says it's easier for us to reinvent it for a private contractor. And I said, you mean the taxpayers have to pay double for something like this? And he said, yes. So here's another proof of inertial shielding, and that is the right-angle turn that's photographed here with open shutter, 35 millimeter on tripod, 2 a.m. outside Stewart Air Force Base. The triangle craft started from the upper part, and the shutter was open, made a tremendous right turn, then continued as if nothing happened. Red and green lights make it look like it's conventional. Next slide.
And Dr. Vallone, you've got about 1 minute.
I understand. I see. And now the conclusion is electrokinetic equation helps explain how we can combine electrokinetics or electrogravitics and inertial shielding. Pulsed current will produce a force. Next slide. And I wrote a book on the electrogravitics effect that's even present in the B-2 bomber, thanks to Paula Violette's work and research, and originally starting with Townsend Brown's research. Next slide. And the conclusion is, and I have to give thanks to Mark McCandlish, who gave a testimony at Dr. Greer's 2001 Disclosure Project in DC, since we know once in a while such electrokinetic powered craft are put on display, as this one was in 1988 in Norton Air Force Base, which is also, his entire testimony is reproduced thanks to Mark in my book, Electrovitics 2. And this was also verified and investigated by Dr. Hal Puthoff. And I talked to him personally about this story of Norton Air Force Base showing 3 hovercraft, and he did his due diligence with it, and he says he put it in his gray box of possible events. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got to say, I'm impressed with the credentials of the people we've heard from, people with doctorate degrees in medicine, and we have, in other words, 2 that are clearly at the highest levels of biological science, if they're medical degrees, which I assume Dr. Lear and Dr. Greer have, and I think, Dr. Vallone, I think you're a physicist, as is Dr. Wood, and in the physical area. So we've got this is a unique opportunity to hear from physical and biological scientists of great stature and qualification. So I'm going to ask Dr. Wood a question I started to ask the other panel, which I wouldn't have asked if I'd known this panel was as qualified in the area. One of the biggest concerns of people, one of the biggest reasons why people don't believe that UFOs have extraterrestrial origins is this whole question of the speed of light. I'm going to ask Robert Wood, how old or large do you think the universe is?
Well,
You're a physicist. You probably thought about these things.
I think the latest estimate is 20 billion years.
Okay. About how large is the Milky Way galaxy, which is just a very tiny little part of the
I think the
universe.
diameter is about 50,000 light years.
It's a 100,000 light years across. Yeah.
It used to be, in the books at that time it was 50, today it's considered to be about 100,000 with the, so if we only went 10, tell me if I'm right about this, if we were only able to send craft at 1/10 the speed of light, if the universe is 15 or 20 billion years old, which I think you've said you think, could a spacecraft go from one end of a 100,000 light year galaxy to the other end of that galaxy in a period of the time of this universe has been in existence,
Well,
15,000 different times and go back and forth? In other words, why is the speed of light such a big problem? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Well,
I'm not trying to say it stops the idea. I'm saying, am I right that a craft could go 15,000 times from one end of the galaxy to the other in the amount of time that's happened? We think in terms of our own time. But I'd just like you to respond to that.
Well, I'd like to answer that in two parts. The first part has to do with the organizational name we are working with, Paradigm Research Group. And the idea of paradigm is that the concepts of science get changed suddenly.
Sure.
And Newton had a paradigm of F equals ma, and Einstein came along and said, no, that's not quite right. When you go close to the speed of light, you've got different equations. Sure. And so the old paradigm was overthrown. My thought here is that the current paradigm that we have, that you can't travel faster than the speed of light, it might be overthrown by what Dr. Greer had said earlier. Sure. Namely, there's a difference between inertial mass.
But it wouldn't be true then that if we could go to the speed of light, it wouldn't be just 15,000 times doing that. We could do that 150,000 times. In other words, speed of light isn't really a barrier to interstellar travel, is it?
In my opinion, the speed of light is not a barrier at all.
Okay, that's what I wanted to establish.
Can I comment on this
yeah,
just
please.
for a moment? Because one of the areas that I don't know how much has been talked about prior to today is the whole area of trans-dimensional physics. So if you're dealing with three-dimensional space or four-dimensional space-time, you have one set of equations. But when you deal with very high voltage systems that cause an alteration in what's called the spin theory, mass, and also inertia, you have another whole set of equations which have not been disclosed yet that then become operative so that you can go from here to the end of our galaxy and back, controlling for time on Earth right now in a matter of perhaps minutes or days.
Okay, and I don't question what you're saying. I'm going to reclaim the time just to say this. I can believe that we do have, wormholes may well be true and so forth. But what I'm trying to say is that the wormhole theories have not been established anywhere near as established as the speed of light and the first relativity theory of Einstein have been established. So what I'm trying to say is we don't have to establish, I'm trying to ask you, we don't necessarily have to establish some of these physics, which may well be true, that could be established into the future, in which there are some interesting indications from even the past that might be happening.
Yes.
So I'd like to,
like to
so
contribute to
so
that,
will you
too.
respond to that, Dr.
Yeah, we run a conference on future energy almost every year now. It'll be one in July at the University of Maryland again. We've had David Fronig there several times as speaker. He's a professor from the University of Adelaide in Australia, and he particularly has worked on this. He actually has simulations of 1 times the speed of light, 5 times, and so forth. He treats it just like the sound barrier. And he literally has equation comparisons for the speed of sound, speed of light, and so forth. So my emphasis is trying to make it simple, and that is the inertial mass is the key to understanding how this is possible. And the special relativity equations, which I'm very familiar with, only deal with inertial mass. So
If I
once you
could
recognize
reclaim my
what-
time really quickly.
yeah, and
If
so
we
we've got a
start
manipulation
talking about artificial intelligence being involved in the control of certain vehicles as opposed to natural intelligence being in control, couldn't we also overcome some of these barriers that people have been talking about? I mean, we send artificial intelligence today out into space. Is that a possibility?
The advanced extraterrestrial technologies do deal with technologies that cross into the
And I see,
conscious quantum hologram and directed thought.
I gotta
and
be
this
clear,
is
I hate to cut
amazing.
you off, but my time has expired. I can't violate what I'm making everybody else live by. But we will now go to Congresswoman Woolsey.
Okay, the first thing I want to do is thank you all for adding an even deeper level of credibility to this hearing that we've had this week. Thank you very much. The subject of ufology is so out there that we have to, many of us have to just know that because of who you are, what we're doing is what we should be doing. So, but speaking of what we should be doing, my question to each of you to answer in the time we have is, where do you believe that the United States ranks in preparation to meet the global needs for the future? And where will the brilliant students that will become adults like yourselves, only some of them have to be women, come from to meet the numbers we're going to need?
Well, when you asked the question, my immediate reaction was, when you said the United States,
Yeah.
I asked myself, who's really in charge of the answer to your question?
Good question.
And so I think the issue which we're dealing with is a truth embargo issue and this enormous secrecy which controls and dominates our entire process, maybe even including the educational process. But if you talk about the ordinary world that most of us think that we live in, clearly we need to establish the ideas that new ideas as the discoveries, as Stan Friedman said, come from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. So I think we need to emphasize the importance of creativity in developing the next set of equations that we need and may have already been discovered, but we need to make our society better and stronger.
Thank you.
Well, I think we already have everything we need to create a sustainable, poverty-free world. It's already extant, and this is very good news. The very bad news is that there is a ruthless, deep national security state that the people I have worked with have run into that is this massive buzzsaw. And I think that at a certain point, we the people and the Congress and the United Nations and other countries have to come together and say, we've had enough of this nonsense. And I do not think this is going to come from an executive order from the president. I think it's going to come from people stepping forward. And I wish to emphasize that, as I did the other day, that in 1998 we declared these unacknowledged special access projects unconstitutional, a priori illegal. And we encouraged, and we now have over 500 people who have come forward to give us information, documents, and what have you on this. And I think we need to continue to do that. I think we have to say to people who are really not responsive to the people that this is still a world of liberty, and we have to be free to know the truth.
Thank you. Very good. Dr. Dr. Vallone.
Could I show slide 23, please, as I'm talking? What I'd like to explain is that I agree with our co-panelists, and that is the United States already has this technology, and I had the privilege of talking with a former Black Project engineer. Spent the whole afternoon with him taking pages and pages of notes, one of which is actually in front of me right here. And what I learned is, first of all, he taught me all the details of creating an electrogravitic layered semiconductor that with bismuth in between and magnesium and zinc with the same percentages that when slide 23 pops up, you'll see that was published years before in a colleague's book called Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. And Dr. Paul LaViolette only let me know a year later, he said, oh, this sounds like what I learned from another Black Project engineer who actually was through Aviation Weekly over in England. So this is very interesting because my contact told me so many things I couldn't believe. I just took the notes down. But after I corroborated this with Linda Moulton Hull's artifact as well, we have 3 different corroborations within 1% variation of the same artifact. In fact, slide 24, if she gets that up, will also show the actual semiconductor. But the important part is that we have the technology. Students are contacting our Integrity Research Institute all the time saying, what should we study? And this is, I used to be a college teacher. You need 13 chapters with questions and answers at the end of each chapter, and the books need to be written. The zero-point energy book, the electrovitics book, the textbooks are the textbooks of the future, and the students are already there waiting to study this stuff. So this is the book I'm talking about, and if we progress to the next slide, we'll see the actual page that Paul was talking about. And this, to me, was amazing synchronicity. So I started to believe the other stuff that this Black Project fellow told me, and that is we already have a base on Mars, which was established in the 1970s. And I said, oh, I don't believe that. He says, oh, go check the NASA records of the greenhouse gases from Mars's atmosphere. They increased in the 1970s. I mean, that was his counterpoint, and so forth. He says we have a deep space platform. He even gave me a jaw dropper, and that was the Gulf Breeze UFO conferences that almost amazingly always had a UFO sighting during the conference. He says, I know the guy who ran that craft. It was a back-engineered craft, and he just did it for fun, fly over the UFO conference and create some stir. So this is the kind of problem we have.
All right, thank you.
These boys with toys.
Thank you. Dr. Lair?
I have a different approach.
Okay.
I'm very pessimistic. I believe that the knowledge, the basic knowledge of all this having to do with we've been using the term extraterrestriality as a more general term than it should be used, because we really don't understand the entire ramifications of the universe itself. We don't know whether this is a multiverse, whether there are various time areas involved, but someone does know. And I believe that at one time, at the days of Majestic 12 and Eisenhower and Truman and so on, and the state that the world was in, it was necessary to keep this a secret from the public. But now I believe, again, I'm sorry to be pessimistic, I believe this has moved on from governments, the United States government, or any other government, into the hands of a greedy industrial complex that does not want it to change.
Time has expired.
Thank you very much.
We'll now go to Representative Bartlett.
Thank you very much. Because I want our deliberations to be most favorably perceived, I have one little question I'd like to get cleared up. I understand that a bit ago there was a petition being circulated in one of our communities suggesting that the city waterworks should stop putting dihydroxide into the water system, because if in the future it was determined to be hazardous to health, it could never be removed. Dihydroxide, of course, is water. And it's true that if you put it in there, it can never be removed. My question has to do with a comment that was made both yesterday and the day before, that we're looking at getting energy from water. Now, I'd always thought of water as the ash you get when you burn hydrogen. So I'm wondering, what am I missing here? Unless you're talking about nuclear energy, I'm having some trouble understanding how you get chemical energy from an ash.
Yes, well,
Can you help clear this up for the record?
I can, and we did a great deal of research on this and actually have a proposal that I've given to the chairman for you to look at. Stan Meyer and other people have found that using very high voltage systems at certain resonant frequencies causes a recruitment of energy from the ambient zero-point energy field that was spoken about, so that you can break the hydrogen-oxygen bond, so you have two gases that you can burn. And when you burn it, the only effluent is water vapor, because it recombines. Now, this was done, and it was operational. Unfortunately, Stan Meyer died under mysterious conditions, and he took those secrets to his grave. His twin brother is still living, and people who work with him are still living. There are a number of them want to work with us in an R&D project to do this, so we convert the internal combustion engines we have now to water engines. And this is not a pipe dream. This is actually something that can be done. So,
my next question, sir, then, I can believe that they did this. But unless they're violating the second law of thermodynamics, which I don't think we think is that
no, they're not.
Violate, there's going to be less energy come out than you put into splitting the
No, that's
molecule?
that's the whole point of what's called an over-unity system. Maybe this didn't get covered, is that you're setting up an electromagnetic pointing vector.
And we can violate the second law of thermodynamics.
No, sir, no, because there's constant conservation of energy, but there's another energy field that hasn't been accounted for. Some may call it the Higgs field.
Thank
now.
you for getting this in the
so,
record.
So there is absolutely no violation of the
gullible.
second law of thermodynamics, none at all, and that's a very important thing to understand. You're actually taking energy. It's been estimated that every cubic centimeter of space in this room has enough energy to run the Earth for a day if you could tap it properly through these systems. So that means the energy is there, but you have to be able to create a vector into that energy field.
The zero-point energy field he's talking about. Yeah. The quantum vacuum, in other words.
Quantum vacuum, yeah.
Okay, I just want this cleared up because I think many people understand chemistry as I do, that water is the ash you get when you burn hydrogen, and it's hard to get energy out of ash, so thank you for clearing that up. I think that there's a general consensus that if these UFOs are real and if they're extraterrestrial, that they somehow have learned to do what we would love to be able to do, and that is have an anti-gravity thing. Okay. I don't know how much we know by reverse engineering these things, how much we know about that. But whatever we know about it, do you think that information is being made available to Stephen Hawking? I haven't heard he died, so I guess he's still alive, and people like him who are trying to harmonize the mysteries of the universe, relativity and gravity and so forth. Do you think I hope it's being made available to them. You think not?
If you're talking about black project discoveries from back engineering, no, I'm sorry. It's the same as in the government. They're all in the dark. And they literally are opposed to anything that would violate their little classical laws of physics that they're used to. I know, I've dealt with professors all my life. And unfortunately, it's a big dichotomy between the ivory towers that they sit in and the black project guys that say, hey, the laws of physics need to be rewritten. And that exact quote has been used many times for those investigating the black world, it's literally called.
It's not just the laws of physics that have to be rewritten, the laws of physiology have to be rewritten, because if there are people, if there are entities in these craft, the maneuvers they make, we couldn't survive it.
Yes, we can. That's what I tried to explain in my slideshow. I'd be glad to pull up slide 18 again and slide 17. This is a very important discovery that's been made, and I'm one of the few that have put these things together to describe 17, which is the inertia. In other words, inertial mass is now known to be a zero-point energy effect. And the slide you're looking at right here is slide 18. That's the conclusion of that. The previous one, 17, is the journal article that is probably front page news and should be. Because once inertia now is discovered to be an electromagnetic phenomenon, that's an exact breakthrough, in other words. And if we go back one slide, the journal article obviously is something we need to refer to, because Hal Puthoff was responsible for that. Bernie Haish, who I know personally, was also responsible, and they proved it. They literally did stochastic electrodynamics to conclude that it's simply a Lorentz force, F equals V cross B. And if you know what I'm talking about, V cross B, velocity crossing with a magnetic field gives you a force. and you see that in electromagnetism, but who would know you could see that in a movement of a vehicle? But you do. In other words, you're moving to the right, you want to turn to the right, and your body is going to the left. That's the Lorentz force. That's exactly what you see in electromagnetism, and now we find that it's in vehicular movement as well. So therefore, this is an interaction between the zero-point field, which is all around us, and the individual electromagnetism of your body, of the craft. And exactly that means shielding is possible. And once the shielding's possible, you've got all kinds of...
My time has expired. Thank you so much.
Expired. Now I'd like to go to our new questioner, Dr. Bookman, who, by the way, ran for Congress from my state not too many years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I believe.
Not against Merrill, though, against your colleague Rob Bishop. Dr. Greer, you mentioned 25-mile wide craft.
26.
26-mile wide craft, and you mentioned that you believe the military-industrial complex has a program of shooting them down. Have we shot down one that big, in your opinion, or from your witnesses?
To my knowledge, those have not been targeted. We do have witnesses, and there is a number of testimonies from pilots where attempts to target and bring them down have occurred. And I think that we have to understand that $2.3 trillion in unaccounted funds in the military-industrial complex have resulted in some very strange things going on. I call it this strange Lovian complex, where there are folks who are doing things without proper oversight from the Congress or the President that are really a threat to our national security. The briefing I did for the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patrick Hughes, really focused on this, and I have never spoken of this publicly until now. But the big concern is that there was a cabal or a deep national security operation of which he knew nothing and did not control, that was doing some rather dangerous things that could endanger not only our nation, but the world. And I think this is an existential threat to not only world peace, and I think we have to start thinking not just of world peace, but of interplanetary relations and universal peace. But to get more specific, there are portable EMP, electromagnetic pulse systems, and others that involve scalar or longitudinal waves that are, as opposed to a light wave that moves like this, are longitudinal, that have been weaponized. And as Wernher von Braun stated in the last years of his life through our disclosure project witness, Carol Rosin, that these sort of technologies are being deployed in this space and should not be. Moreover, there's a number of false flag operations that have happened, as was referred to in Gulf Breeze, where there have been objects that appear to be ET that aren't, and contact events that appear to be alien that aren't. And these include the manufacture at EG&G near the Nellis Range of a number of implants. As you know from our witness, Mr. Pawlik, who worked with the CIA, they were manufacturing up to 2 billion of these in the 70s and 80s. This interview is on YouTube. There's a number of things I have not had time to go into that I really do believe are an existential threat to our planet.
And I wish we had time to go into them now.
Right, yeah.
Maybe on the break, maybe people can read up on this too.
Yes.
If I'm doing my dual job correctly, I have about 3 minutes left.
Yes,
so
sir.
somebody time me and cut me off or I'll go forever. Thank you for that. If I understand correctly, Linda Moulton Howe, George Knapp, Dolan, yourself, have had conversations with people deep in the military-industrial complex who've told you things off the record, privately. It would make a great movie, I gather. By the way, Disclosure, the Sirius movie is a great movie as well.
Thank you.
If the United States Congress, or what would you need, what do you feel they would need from the United States Congress in order to be able to feel safe testifying on 60 Minutes or somewhere? I mean,
Right.
I appreciate your point, Dr. Lear, and others have made this, that we have an oath to the Constitution, not to some independent agency that's gotten out of control.
Correct.
What would it take for those people to be free to their secrecy oaths such that they could appear in the media publicly on these issues?
Well, I think the question is, would the media even allow it? As I mentioned, when ABC News wanted to do this with 35 digital hours of top secret testimony, Ira Rosen was shot down by corporate ABC. That's one question. The other question becomes, I think some of these people, and the briefing I put together for the president that went to him via John Podesta, Center of American Progress, was oriented towards getting those executive actions done, because we need federal marshal protection for some of these people. I know who they are. I'm holding their documents. It's part of, I hate to say this, part of my dead man trigger If anything happens to me, it'll hit the internet. I'm probably more valuable alive than dead.
I hope you stay that way, sir.
Well, from the point of view of keeping the secrecy there. But I'm not going to violate people's confidentialities. What I will say is that there's an enormous amount of actionable intelligence we have, and names can be provided, including members of this majestic committee with whom I've met. And many of them would like to see this information come out. The problem is lethal force has been threatened and used. And I think that this has become something that needs an FBI investigation, congressional investigation, and subpoenas.
I have 1 minute left. If I've timed myself correctly here, I'll do this.
Yes, sir.
Are you saying there's nothing Congress could do to pass legislation? When I ran for Congress, I called for legislation protecting whistleblowers. This administration has been prosecuting whistleblowers like crazy.
Right.
And I said we need to protect whistleblowers on waste, fraud, criminal activity, and the UFO issue. And all the media focused on in my campaign was ridiculing me over UFOs. Thank you, media. Is there anything Congress could do such that those people would feel safe?
Yes,
And
they
I'll
can
end with that
they can
question.
issue subpoenas, and they can also require the Federal Marshal Protective Services to protect them, and they would be. And I think that this is something that can be done if there was the will and the intent within the Congress. Barring that, I think we've brought out as many people as we can. One of my frustrations is knowing too many people and having too much information that I can't give actionable intelligence on to the general public without violating. I take this like a doctor with patient confidentiality, without protecting those people's confidentiality. But we have this information. I would love to be subpoenaed so I could give it over to a proper authority.
I've heard that from George Knapp and others as well. You're not alone in that. There are a lot of witnesses that, if protected, would come out. And with that, I see my time is up.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Berkman. We'll now go to Senator Gravel.
I am not qualified to get into the technical discussion, but I would say this. Dr. Wood referred to, if the black area has this knowledge. You've pointed out that whoever was the head of the CIA at the time, shut the door on, and I would, and Dr. Vallone, we've heard testimony before about the fact that somebody was boasting from one of these black areas, which is these contractors, that we have the capability to take ET back home. Is that something briefly squares with your knowledge at this point in time?
Absolutely. That's a quote from the former CEO of Lockheed, I believe.
Yes, yeah. Ben Rich.
Ben Rich. So it's a famous quote,
well,
and
then
it's true.
Okay, but
I would agree with it.
If you think that's believable, and that's a quote from the head of a corporation, this is criminal.
Absolutely.
Because we go back to what Dr. Greer was saying, that we have the capability of sharing this technology and freeing up the world to an unbelievable level. Yeah. So we stand capable of indicting in the area of public opinion the head of what, Lockheed?
Yes.
Well,
that's right, Skunk Works. And he knew what he was talking about because he had all the
That's
contracts.
fine. I'll accept that he knows what he's talking about. He's depriving the world of possible advancement. Yep. Here, all of you, all four of you, you interface with scientists in the whole black area. You know, you're trying to talk. Where's their moral content?
Well, I can answer that if you.
Where is it? They got a hole somewhere.
Ben Rich wrote a book, and he specifically described the sundown rule. And I wrote about it. It's on our website. It's one of the recommendations we have. The sundown rule should be enforced. And that is classified, fine. How many years? You have to put a time limit on every classified document. And therefore, it's going down. The sun's going down in 10 years, and it becomes free. And the public gets access to it. Well, right now, we have about 50 years.
Well, I got to tell you, the Congress has tried to put that kind of a rule in on the laws, and it's never worked.
I know.
So,
well, this is why
good luck in your
it's at least
field.
one solution.
Well, this is why I think in the tradition of Martin Luther King, in the tradition of Susan B. Anthony, in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson, we should say, the hell with these games. People who know this, I believe, as you said, have a moral obligation to our children and our grandchildren to step forward with the truth truth with the technology and with the information, because there is a criminal national security deep state that has basically thumbed its nose at the Constitution. And for that reason, there is no justification for the continued secrecy. And I think that one of the things all of us as citizens have to decide is whether we're going to do that or not. Could it be risky? Yes. Do we have to make sacrifices? Yes. But you know, part of it gets into everybody puts their pants on one leg at a time. I was talking to the deputy director of the National Science Foundation, and I turned to him and I said, we really need your help getting this information, this technology out. He says, yes, I'd love to, but it'd be the end of my career. And I said, okay, on one hand, we have the fate of the future of humanity. On the other hand, we have your career.
Your selfish career. Your selfish career. I saw your film the other night. I want to compliment you on it. I thought that was awesome. But let me just, I think I said it in an earlier day. You know, nobody questions authority anymore. The whole population is gutless, and we pat ourselves on the back that we're so wonderful. We're the leaders of the world. My God, we are stifling the ability of the world to go forward. And we put that aside because, we're questioning our patriotism. Well, we need to question our patriotism. I want to give one example. When the Pentagon Papers was sent over to the House and the Senate, they were put under guard, and a member could only go in and read them and couldn't take any notes. And I was 42 years old. When I was 23 years old, I could classify top secret documents. Are we not at a situation where it's absolutely ridiculous? And then after they were released, it was moot. The Supreme Court was made moot, the Congress was made moot, and the decision was made that any member of Congress can release any information of all these secrets, and it hasn't happened since 1972. So the indictment is on us as a Congress, and that's the reason why when the whole purpose of this hearing was, we'll take this to Congress and have another hearing. Boy, that's just taking the issue and putting it on a shelf forever, and it just won't happen. Yeah, I'll yield for a question or a statement.
Well, I just wanted to say the sunset rules actually are in effect. The Brady gun laws sunsetted after 5 years, and and then it wasn't continued. I mean, we never went back and visited it. So it's there when, and it depends on who's the issue, and it depends on who's in the leadership.
If there's,
well, there's
here,
a
the
declassification.
sunset principle is
sundown rule,
Congress has the ability to go back and see anything. We have an oversight capacity. If there's one activity in the Congress that's not dealt with properly, is our oversight capacity.
I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, when I've met with oversight chair, for example, Congressman Dan Burton, members of the Senate Intelligence Committee who were in office, they're very interested. But what I have found, there's a disconnect between what people want to know and what people want to do. There's a fear of touching this subject because of the ridicule factor and other reasons. And I think we just have to become more courageous.
Well, and also know what you want to ask for declassification.
I'd like to meet with you later, anyways.
Could I mention there's an Office of Declassification in College Park, Maryland? That's where the official federal government Office of Declassification is. It's solicitable, you can approach them, and if you know what to ask for, that's the key, then you can ask for it to be declassified.
Your time is not quite expired.
Not expired.
I see the sign right there, it's already stopped.
It just expired.
There it goes.
That's why I
You
stopped.
used up my time asking questions. It's expired.
Okay. Now we'll go to Representative Kilpatrick.
Now I'm questioning now, right? As I
Yes, you're
understand it.
questioning
Okay,
now.
thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Excellent panel. Excellent, way over my head. I did see Sirius the other night, which was also way over my head, but I got parts of it. And the whole week has helped me get more and more. But your sitting here today brings back for me the validity, the intelligence, and the necessity of moving forward with this incident. It's just, you have to do it. And you all have provided, without even saying it as an introduction, the technology that exists in the world that we don't now yet display that we have. We may have it, I don't know, we don't display that we do. It's a real critical concern to our national security and to other things, so I want to commend you for that. I think that's excellent. Dr. Lear, I want to go to you. You talked about removing 16 objects from people. I think in my reading and preparation, that was called implantation, and I might have that wrong. Is that the right word?
That is absolutely correct.
Oh, good. Okay, hey, I'm learning something here. Okay, then when you, and it also is related to people who have been implanted with something, and you described that it was different kind of material that didn't meet the usual, which means to me it came from somewhere else. Is that correct?
That's correct. I submitted to the committee a set of scientific documents that shows some of the latest work and findings that we find in the material science of these objects. But I want to point out, too, that to my shock, absolute shock, was a paper that was given to me through the Freedom of Information Act, in which it describes all my work in the OSTP in the White House, given to President Obama at the time he was trying to raise money for the medical care bill. And the individual that wrote the article stated that if my work was not correct, or the work done by my team was not correct, and that it was secret work that was done by some governmental agency, this also should be released to the public because it would save billions of dollars in health care.
And what is the implication? Break that down for me, please.
Well, if we took just the fact that there is no inflammatory response of these objects and no rejection of these objects, you can see that you could take anything that we use medically, a pin, a screw, a nail, a heart, a kidney, any organ, place it into the body would not reject it, and the individual would not have to be on very expensive anti-rejection medication for the rest of their lives. Now, that has nothing to do at all with the material science associated with these objects that we have found here. This is a very advanced nanotechnology. These are nanotechnological devices in which nanocarbon tubes, either single or double wall, I won't go into the whole explanation, but they can be elongated and weaved into carbon nanofibers, carbon nanostrands, and they end in crystalline structures, which are what we call orthorhombic, which are regular rectangular structures. And we have to remember that in the early days, when I was a child, on radio, and you got a crystal set with a battery and an earphone, and you were able to get a radio station, that was a marvel. So here's a very, very advanced when I say nanotechnological, I'm talking about things that are on a level of the size of an atom, using the principal elements of certain materials, putting them together in such a way so that you're actually broadcasting or switching what we perceive as a radio wave, which may not be a radio wave. It could be scalar technology, which when reaches our electromagnetic spectrum, is converted to a radio wave harmonic, which I know is a little bit complex. But it is sending information to somebody. So somebody out there is listening to something going on in our bodies. Now, we know that even John Glenn, when he went into space originally, complained on public television that he had to swallow implants because this was vital information needed on the physiology of the body to know what was going on in space.
Okay. And so therefore, your conclusion, you and your team, as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to our country, as it relates to our budget, and to our phenomenon topic we've been talking about today, what do you conclude?
Well, I conclude that if there was funding, at least funding, or open-mindedness from the scientific community, which there is not, because they also pray to higher masters. They don't want to lose their jobs. They have families to feed. They don't want to look at this stuff in the way that we've looked at it for the benefit of mankind.
Thank you very much.
Aye. If we can bring up slide 25, I would like to show 25, 26, and 27 very quickly, and that is scalar waves are hugely important, because what Dr. Lear just mentioned is a big, another overcoming of the speed of light problem with electromagnetic waves traveling so slow, there's no communication possible across the Milky Way. Well, it turns out there is, and this is a proof of it, the Chilbolton crop circle. Based on the Arecibo message that was sent out in 1974, we all of a sudden have this amazing phenomenon that shows a scalar generator antenna right at the bottom of the diagram that copies. This diagram actually is the original one that was sent out in 1974 from Arecibo. It's a digital message that was sent out with the most powerful telescope available at the time, thanks to Frank Drake SETI program. And what happened in 1990, I don't have the exact date here, 2001, August 2001, next slide, there was an appearance of a crop circle overnight right next to a radio telescope in Chilbolton, England. And the amazing thing was, it wasn't just a regular crop circle. This thing had almost exactly the same one-to-one correspondence to the Arecibo message. Slide 26, please, and then slide 27. And that's exactly what the thing looked like. The crop circle is just a bunch of crops that are down or up. And then the next one is 27. And we see at the bottom of 27, instead of the Arecibo antenna, which is a parabolic dish, we're seeing something that looks like two circular objects that literally, it says a change in transmitter diameter from one of the online commentaries on Chilbolton. And the very bottom is something that describes a scalar broadcast antenna that is actually the answer to instantaneous communication across the Milky Way. Enough said. This is a big breakthrough.
Thank you. Now we'll go to closing statements from representatives.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. First, to Stephen Bassett and the Citizen Hearing team and family, I want to say thank you for the invitation. I'm certainly a much wiser, better public servant than I was before I walked through these doors. To my panel, my colleagues, you've been excellent. Many times we are so busy in Congress, we don't get to know each other unless we travel in what's called congressional delegations and do some work, or work on the committee. You know best your committee and your caucus. And beyond that, these things help. So thank you very much. And to the staff and all of you. To the witnesses who have been with us all week, outstanding. I think it's America's loss that none of the press across this country felt the obligation to cover these hearings. The information that we've learned, that American people should also have learned, and those who streamed, God bless them, probably did get some of it, will make them better people as we confront the next 100 years, the next 1,000 years. Because I really believe, and I wasn't convinced before I came in, but we did a little 2-minute interview on the close of this. And what I said in mine is, I didn't know before, and I still have a lot to learn. But I'm willing to learn, because it's a universal problem, and I want my grandchildren and yours and our great-grandchildren to have a universe from which to operate. So on behalf of this Congresswoman, as I go about my day and catch my plane and hope it lands smoothly, doctors, that I can come back and be with you again. We've got a lot of work to do. But I think you educate the people from the bottom up and not from top down. It doesn't work like that. We've done it in revolutions all over this world for hundreds of years. This is a revolutionary issue. And if we're going to sustain ourselves as humans, just a part of the universe, we've got work to do. To all of you, and I'm looking and seeing some of you in the audience as you presented to us, thank you for allowing me to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Congresswoman Kilpatrick. Dr. Bookman, you've got just a minute of announcements before the break.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say to the honorable representative from Michigan, you, ma'am, are a hero. You're a hero just as much as any of these witnesses. When we reached out to former members of Congress, the answer from many was, well, who else is going to be on that committee with me? I'll serve, but I won't serve with so-and-so, or I want to know who else is there. You agreed to do this not knowing any of that. You stood up and said, yes, I'll do it, and opened the space for everyone else to be here. Before you leave, I wanted to share that with you. So on behalf of the Paradigm Research Group, You, ma'am, are our John Glenn. First one up to orbit the Earth. Thank you. That's all.